is Dr. Richard Sugg. I'm going to say that again. Hello, everyone. Our next speaker is Dr. Richard Sugg, speaking on dangerous fairies. Sorry, I said that really strangely. I said dangerous fairies there. Actually, it's dangerous fairies. Again, deeping into the folklore and legends of the British Isles. Richard is a doctor of English, but he is now much more into cultural history, so he's our kind of guy. So, on dangerous fairies, and he's got quite a unique presentation thing here, so do please enjoy it. Please welcome Dr. Richard Sugg.
Many thanks, and thanks to Scott, and thanks to technical people for adapting images, which I think we're going to see in a moment. I'm going to start off being slightly cheeky because I'm being paid to be here, you've paid to be here, but I'd like to do a quick bit of research, if that's okay. So, the research is something you won't be used to, probably. First off, who would say they believe in the existence of ghosts or poltergeists? Okay. So I've got a bit of a light in my eyes. I'm trying to get a hand count. Thanks. Okay, good. Who would say they've experienced or suffered or met a ghost or poltergeist? Okay, great. That's good research. Thank you. I'd have to pay for that normally. Excellent. Okay, that helps a bit because there's going to be some strange stuff. Okay, so...
If it pauses, you might just need to wiggle the mouse a bit.
Okay, I won't need it for long, thanks. So, yeah, one of the things about poltergeists, of course, as some of you will know, is a kind of unstable energy. So I'm just going to kick off with a few lovely images from kids at Sussex Primary School, which I like for a couple of reasons. One, because they buck the stereotype of what you might expect kids would do with fairies when they've been saturated by a lot of Disney rubbish. This is a good, and this gets into the book, actually. It's actually by a girl, the Fairy of War. And they've also got, some of these fairies, a lovely kind of fairy energy or poltergeist energy. And it reminds me of a sighting from Dryborough Church in Scotland, I think it's about 1827, where the fairies at sunset suddenly come rushing through the window, and lovely phrase, fistle, 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 kind of like agitated birds, tiny little fairies, through the church and disappear, is particularly impish one. So I'm going to talk about landscape. That is my favourite as well, actually. Yeah. I hope, if Disney ever patents that, I hope the kid makes a lot of money. That I know I did, and asked me, but going to talk about the landscape, mainly outside, and kind of thinking about a world where people were outside a lot. There was one Scottish estate servant in the 19th century who was calculated by the time he was about 70 to have been on foot and horseback about 230,000 miles. He was still going, by the way. I think it was about 10 times the circumference of the Earth. So you were outside, you were more likely to see things, to hear things, to sense things. And as we'll see, there is a kind of total fairy sensory going on in these fairy lands. And I'm going to start with a kind of more distant and move in towards the very strange and get kind of up close and personal as we go along. So this was a world where people were haunted by wonder and haunted by terror. They were haunted by memory, and they were haunted by a landscape which froze events into a kind of physical memory across the landscape, and for an impressively long time. So I'll give you an example of how this kind of fairy glamour, fairy danger, and landscape was frozen into the territory, and how it was conveyed by people who probably had no written language, but conveyed it across generation after generation. Eddie Lenihan, you might know, is an Irish storyteller, story collector. And Lenihan recalled collecting stories from an uneducated elderly man around about 2000, and he was saying goodbye after the interviews. When at the door, he just pointed out across the valley and said, "Do you see those trees? Just before the famine, there used to be a house there. Now, here we were in 2000 or 2002, and the famine was 1845, 1847, and he named the girl who used to babysit in the house and told me a story about her. Now, the house is gone, Only the trees are left. But he can still remember the girl's name who babysat at that house before the famine. And I said, what the hell? That is memory. It is, I think, but it's pretty thin stuff compared to Yorkshire, a tumulus covered in trees now called Willie Howe, unusual-looking hill. So anything unusual belonged to the fairies or the devil, as you know, in the old days. And Willie Howe was the site in the time of Henry I, who died 1135, of a fairy banquet. Chap heard the fairy banquet, went in, they gave him a goblet of wine. He knows the deal with fairy food, fairy wine. You don't eat it or drink it. You might have seen this in David Mitchell's Slade House recently. So he throws the wine out, but he keeps the goblet, runs off with it. And the goblet, a bit like sort of alien artifacts now, turns out to be made of no earthly material. It's impressive stuff, and he gives it to Henry I. So that's before 1135. Locals still repeated that story to a historian in the 19th century, about 1861. So Lenihan's version was fairly recent history. But people knew these stories, they kept these stories, and their landscape was saturated by the fairies. The fairies had an impressive pedigree. They descended from the fallen angels. So, as a Scotsman would tell you, about 1900, the fallen angels started tumbling out of heaven, going into hell. Christ and God realized this was a bit of a problem. So Christ said, look, shut the doors up, shut the doors up. So they shut the doors to hell, they shut the doors to heaven. You got angels in hell, few angels left in heaven, and you've got ones trapped in the middle. The fairies are descended from the ones trapped in the middle, and they fall everywhere. Fairies of the air, fairies of the earth, and fairies of the sea. So you've got a total kind of fairy ecology. Okay, so starting from the more kind of ambient, what could you hear of the fairies? Well, if you were around Cardigan Bay, there was an area under the water that was known as the Welsh Atlantis, a supposedly drowned town or drowned city underneath. And you could hear the bells of a sunken church ringing, allegedly, at certain times. And we have a Mrs. Powell, Victorian, who remembers being 7 in 1852 and lying in bed, refusing to sleep, desperately wishing to hear the chimes of the church. She didn't hear it, but actually, Victorian scholar Sir John Rees stated that at a certain phase of the tide of the River Dovey, the pebbles would move in a certain way that sounded bell-like. So who's to say that you're not hearing the bells of a fairy church if you think you are, if you're 7? I mean, would you want to be the one to tell her it wasn't true, you know, people like Santa Claus? Yeah, we have this. We have Kremlin Lake between Britain Ferry and Swansea, which had another sunken fairy town or fairy palace underneath, and again, you could possibly hear the fairy bells. Lake Bala, I think it was once the biggest sheet of water in Wales, in Gwynedd. And at this point, when it froze and the ice was kind of frozen into ruckles on the surface and a southwesterly wind came over, you could hear a bell-like sound on the ice. So again, only at a certain time. You've got to be outside to hear it, or you've simply got to be in an old-fashioned house where you don't have very good ceiling for the windows, for the roof, for the door. You're much more open to the world, so that in Lincolnshire in the 19th century, people would hear a fairy type called Tiddymun, and it was described as like the sound of a lapwing, like a bird, and you'd shiver and sort of move closer to the fire and feel comfortable because there's the dangerous fairy out there and you're safe inside. The point is that you can hear it, which you wouldn't, of course, in the modern world in a lot of houses. So, what can you hear? You can hear these sounds that are real sounds, and my favourite of these is the Isle of Man on Dalby Mountain. The old people would, around the 19th, early 20th century, put their ears to the mountain, which was near the coast, and they would hear a murmuring sound, which they described, I'm not going to try and read the Manx, but they described as, quote, the sounds of infinity. Think for a moment about all the easily available, endlessly repeated, digitally cheap music you can get hold of. Have you ever heard the sounds of infinity? We've been shut out of this forbidden frequency of wonder, despite how much easier it is to hear music. Even Wentz, who was a bit fairy-struck, admitted that it was probably just the sound of the waves on the shore, but it was no good telling that to these people. And in fact, in this case, this was the fairies of the air. This was the fairies of the air, which were invisible beings filling all of the air. So we don't get the fairies of the air so much, but they do feature here. On the Isle of Man, and I've no idea what this means, there was a certain bank, kind of beautiful spot with a steep bank, a river, and people would hear exhaled out of the air, as it was described, singing, unearthly singing, which they were sure was fairy song. And it was real enough, as far as they were concerned, to gather to listen sociably to this music on summer evenings. Whatever it was, I cannot tell you. One thing you might have heard, if you have visited coasts of Britain, and I've heard it myself, is seal song. Has anyone heard seal song? Seals? Yeah, good. I mean, it's the most haunting thing. It's extraordinary. And seals, of course, can look sort of oddly human and hybrid. So if you believe that seals are the souls of those drowned in the original flood, and you hear seal song, wow, must have been quite something. But even now, when you're a bit skeptical, it still sounds very beautiful. Okay, now here's a strange one. See what you make of this. It's 1922, and a group of friends are picnicking on Dartmoor in the summer, and suddenly they can hear music in the air. I'm just going to read this directly because it's quite important. It was overhead, faint as a breath. It died away, came back louder, over me, swaying like a censer that dips. It lasted 20 minutes. My field glasses assured me no picnickers were in sight. It was not a gramophone, nor was it an illusory noise in my ears. This music was essentially harmonic, not a melody nor an air. It sounded like the weaving together of tenuous fairy sounds. I listened with every faculty drawn out to an intensity. I am prepared to say on oath that what I wrote down is so close to the original that the authors themselves would not know the difference. The music drifted into silence, no more came then or since. I was reasonably certain that I had been deliberately encouraged to listen to the supernatural. Okay, so who is this wacky character? Well, he's none other than the composer and sometime Oxford Music Fellow, Dr. Thomas Wood. So he knows what he's talking about when he describes the type of music. What he was hearing, I have no idea. There are similar reports of this kind of thing heard by various people outside. And Wood actually scored this, so the score is available. Chris Woodyard in America has played this, you can hear it. Anyone wants to do a first, told that a couple of violins would make a good job, so a live fairy music performance is yet to happen. Okay, fairy music, fairy sounds. You could smell fairies on the Isle of Man. I've not come across this elsewhere, but on the Isle of Man you could smell them. It was a sour, stale smell. And there was one farmer on the Isle of Man said to the local vicar at Kirkmallow around 1882, I've never seen a fairy, but I know they exist because I smell them all the time in this particular glade. So what would you see? What would you see? A particularly good place for this is the west of Ireland. I haven't actually been. It makes me very much want to go there. But yes, you could see, for example, if you looked west, one of various mythic isles. There were many of these. So you had the Isle of the Blessed, the Isle of Youth, O Brazil, and perhaps most impressively, you had one called Ladra. And this was a mythic island where just before the flood, there was a chap who escorted the niece of Noah, Césaire, and took her away from the flood to Ireland. He became the first man ever to be buried on Ireland, apparently. And you would look out for this whenever you're on the coast, certain shift of light, and you might see something that you thought was Ladra, but definitely once every 7 years, you'd see the whole thing covered in houses, covered in churches. We have an anonymous but educated, insofar as he could write, author from 1857, who at about 4 o'clock, following a thunderstorm, saw 7 yachts, masts, and white sails with what appeared to be a confused mass of other vessels behind them. This was off Galbally Point in Antrim. And he was so convinced by this that he asked somebody if there wasn't a regatta going on around. And he went indoors to get a telescope. When he got back with the telescope, it had all disappeared, all melted into air. And we have also another educated author. Thomas Westrop was a big collector of fairy lore from Ireland, and he was an Anglo-Irish character, so not an indigenous fairy believer. But in 1878, Westrop thought he saw over Inishturk Island fairy ships and boats sail in the air. And this was so convincing to Westrop and so fascinating, he sketched it all down. In 1918, he remembered this vision when in June, from Kilkee, looking out into the sunset, he saw strange cloud effects, which he knew were strange cloud effects, but it was so perfect that it was like the illusion of a city. He was spellbound by this. So, yeah, your whole sense is saturated in wonder. Also in Ireland, 1937, 88-year-old woman that said to her, "How are you doing at 88? She said, "I'm okay, except for the fairies in the marsh. If it wasn't for the fairies in the marsh, I'd be much better." And she was quite sturdy. She took a younger man out with her to the marsh, walked through the marsh, and said to him, "Don't tread on those white flowers." Why not? Because they're fallen angels. They're fallen angels. So, yeah, fairies, fallen angels, they were still going in 1937. Where else would you see fairies? Well, in rather more mundane settings, you could also see them in Wales at the markets of Cardigan, of Larne, of Milford, and of Pembroke. How would you know there were fairies there? Well, you could see them and hear them. When everything got very noisy and very bustling and there was a lot of bartering going on, it meant that prices were about to go up, and the fairies were notorious for this. They invaded your market and forced your prices up. So they started off at Cardigan and people got fed up with them, so they went off to Pembroke. And we know very precisely what the fairies looked like. If you ever go to the market and want to look out for the fairies, they looked exactly like this. Very strange people had been seen at the market at Pembroke. Very strange people. So, yeah, Daily Mail exclusive. It's true, fairies do raise our prices. Yeah, they looked like us. A surprising number of shapes and types and colours that fairies could take. They could look just like human beings, but ones that you didn't know from round here. So, fairy wonder and fairy reverence. In Scotland, in Gaelic, I'll spend a few minutes in Gaelic, there's a couple of cases there, northwest Scotland. There was a fairy boy, quite a famous fairy boy, called the Black Boy, from the colour of his hair, in the 18th century. And he was seen in the birch woods, he was reported time and time again. He dressed only in leaves and green moss, this kind of feral child. And I guess it sounds like he was a real person. And the suspicion with this is that he was perhaps mentally handicapped, perhaps mentally ill, perhaps autistic. Certainly the large number of cases where a farm has a fairy that works in the barn for them, and it works year in, year out, sleeps in the barn. The only problem is if you ever offer it another blanket, it gets touchy and it runs off. You know, you mean it well, but it doesn't like this change to its routines. There's this sense of a very severely autistic person thrown by a change to routine. And I think perhaps some people did make a kind of marginal life for themselves, pretending to be fairy boys in this way. I'm studying at the moment for a new history of disgust, the history of insanity in the 19th century, pretty horrific thing about what people did to their relatives when they mured them up indoors rather than in asylums, and the kind of terror, taboo, disgust attaching to insane or sometimes mentally handicapped people makes you realise actually a life as a fairy boy in the glades, even in Scotland when it's pretty chilly, wasn't such a bad one. You kind of pushed your way out from the ragged edges of disgust and terror into the bright glades of myth. So you were, you know, rather than beneath, you were above, and people were afraid of you. But there was something much more frightening in Gaelic in the 1850s, and this was the Gaelic Kelpy. The Gaelic Kelpy lived in Loch na Baist, which means Loch of the Beast, and the locals were in a particular terror of it in the 1850s. A local clergyman, Sandy MacLeod, has seen it one Sunday, looking like a big boat with its keel turned up. And the size of it is vividly illustrated by the tale of a very dauntless man who was seen fishing to catch the Gaelic Kelpy using a whole sheep as a bait. Now, unfortunately enough, we had an English invading landowner at this time, Meyrick Banks. He was the estate man, but he had his work cut out for him when the locals rose in insurrection and demanded that he pump out the lake to get rid of the Kelpy. So Banks, being a Victorian industrialist, didn't balk at this, got a ship from Liverpool with a pump sailed up, tried to pump out the loch, but nature rebelled against this mechanistic invasion and kept pumping water in from the burn at the same time. So what's he going to do? Everyone's down tools until he sorts this out. He basically sends out his own sailors. None of the locals would go on the lake, so he sends his own sailors out with a boat. They plumb the depths until they find a suspiciously deep, kelpy-shaped hole with their oars. and then they get 14 barrels of hot anti-Kelpy lime and pour this into the hole, after which, as far as we know, there was no further trouble. More benign fairy animals, or fairy beasts, fairy dogs are a big one. Fairy dogs have a pedigree worthy of the Kennel Club. They stretch back to the Mabinogion. They're often white, but they often have red ears, and often have red hats. Red hats is a key fairy dog accessory, and it's lucky to see them. Now, here's where we get into the ghost and poltergeist area. There was a farmer in Lyme Regis, I think it was the 19th century, who had a goblin dog, described it as a goblin dog, and it obviously wasn't a real dog, but it would lie by his fire every night, and it was, as he said, remarkably cheap to feed. Was this actually the ghost of a dog? I've heard of quite a few cases. Barbara Cartner was a big one for having ghosts of her dogs. They've been cited in many cases. And one house in England, it was only a few decades ago, I think, there was real dogs lived in the house, and there were ghost dogs, and they used to play together. That's got to be true. If you don't want that to be true, there's something very wrong with you. But yeah, fairy dogs, keep an eye out. Keep an eye out. If you put your hand through it, it's no natural dog. Ireland also had a fairy dog curfew where the dog would come in at a certain time of the evening. Instantly, that was the fairy dog. Everyone had to go to bed, keep the fire lit for the dog, leave some food out. Sounds quite a dodge if you're a clever dog, and you would teach it to your pups if you could. That was treated with reverence, I suppose. Fairy rabbits, on the other hand, were treated with terror, with absolute terror. Anyone's come across witch rabbits or magical rabbits? You get different versions across England and Ireland. In Ireland, it tended to be a fairy rabbit. It could be various colours, but a couple of people were shooting rabbits in County Clare in 1910, and one of the rabbits got away. So in a sort of burst of hubris here, a rabbit that could escape your marksmanship couldn't be a natural rabbit. It was a fairy rabbit, and everybody fled in absolute terror from this unnatural beast. But in Yorkshire, a witch rabbit, as it was termed there in the 19th century, sent one guy home to bed, and he died of terror, voodoo death. It does happen. Bit more sort of low-key territory near where I come from in St Albans. I was listening keenly to these tales of St Albans graffiti. But in the Chilterns, the naturalist Oliver Pike used to hear from the locals, absolutely adamant, that fairy dogs hunted in packs in the Chilterns. This was 1926. And Pike, of course, being a naturalist, knew what was going on. He said, well, weasels do actually hunt in packs of 40 and are quite dangerous. But again, you couldn't tell these people that they were not fairy dogs. What else would you see? Just a couple more indications in Scotland and in Yorkshire. In Scotland, there's a type of lichen, which is yellowish, but when it freezes and when it thaws, it goes red. What was this lichen? It was the blood of fairies after their battles, which they like to fight particularly on Halloween. In Yorkshire, there were various midgets named in the 19th century who were known to have simply been taken by the fairies when they were children near a certain kind of hill. One of them I used to rock climb actually when I was at Leeds. They were taken from their parents and never grew properly. They were such a height, and they were changelings. Their whole life, which is quite a strange fate. I mean, if you're a fairy changeling in belief, popular belief in Britain in fairy times, you were in real danger, of all sorts of suffering. But these people somehow survived into adulthood as fairy changelings. Okay, now things get slightly more up close and slightly strange and spooky. And this is the dead. What did fairies mean in terms of the dead? And all across Britain, what fascinates me, it's been indicated in the previous two talks in very powerful ways. Although people were nominally Christian, Christianity was their whole cosmos, the hierarchy, the elite were Christian, people had a refreshingly stubborn resistance to being told what they didn't want to hear. And for most people across most of history, there was nothing but magic and a kind of quiet heresy in all sorts of areas. They were very pious people, but according to orthodoxy, they were heretics. And one way with the heretics was that in Ireland particularly, which is of course an area that would preserve a porous boundary between the living and the dead in Catholicism, in Ireland, according to one Irishman that Andrew Lang spoke to, about half the people supposed dead are with the fairies. The afterlife was a fairy world. And a kind of touching ecology of bereavement, I suppose, was that if you had a woman who died in childbirth, she went to the fairies. If you had a stillborn baby, it became a pixie. Anyone who was very young, died very suddenly, unnaturally, was not really dead. They were with the fairies. And it was quite precise. The corpse, you look at the corpse, that's not them. They've been taken by the fairies. The fairies are in charge of the underworld. And somebody stated very precisely in the 20th century in Armagh, the fairies are the spirits of the dead, and they say that if you have many friends deceased, you have many friendly fairies, or if you have many enemies deceased, you have many fairies looking out to do you harm, which actually is quite apt for poltergeists. We'll come to this dualism in a moment. Okay, so possibly you don't believe a word of this, but who are you going to believe if you're going to believe anybody? Well, hopefully the police. You know, you can trust them to be responsible, trained observers. Perhaps not, however, in 1863 in Carrick-on-Suir, County Tipperary, because here two police constables, Joseph Rees and James Hayes, have fallen under the spell of what would probably be a cunning woman again, but called in this case a fairy woman, Mary Doheny. She had powers to heal cattle and stop drought and various things, so they paid quite a bit of money for it. Anyway, Mary had allegedly shown to the Reeves family 3 of their dead relatives, and they were under her spell quite powerfully. It was even conjectured that she drugged them into some sort of insanity. The case finally came to court because Hayes, Police Constable Hayes, resigned his post under the belief that he was about to be given a substantial fairy estate in Carrick. So his colleague thought this was going to have to be stopped. It ends up in court in September 1864, and there's a wonderful exchange between Mrs. Reeves and the magistrate, Mr. Hannah. Is your father dead? He died about 3 years ago, but he is now living in Carrick-on-Suir. How can you say that? Because I saw him. And this was apparently the case, that Mary Doheny showed people their dead relatives, showed several people, several relatives. It was dark, nobody spoke, but at the same time she was also carrying food and drink and tobacco and letters, for money of course, to these dead relatives. She was jailed in the autumn 1864, but everybody in the court passionately believed that she was right, that her relatives were actually alive and that she could leave her prison cell at will, even while she was locked up. Okay, better still than this, I think, perhaps my favourite fairy death story is the case of Matthew Lally in County Callows, in the Callows, County Longford. 1848, a soldier called Matthew Lally returns from his regiment and comes to a couple called the Lallies, elderly couple, who've lost their son. He died 16 years ago, and dead and buried. And he says to them, okay, it's not true, good news, I am your son, I am alive. And gets to show them a birthmark, which he's got, and their son had a similar birthmark, persuades them to open the coffin, and there's nothing in the coffin except a log of wood. So what's going on here? Well, everybody gathers round, astonished, delighted, and Lally relates to them the friends of many of their friends and relatives, also dead, who've been enjoying the hours of fairy revel in the afterlife. So general belief in this. Lally presently disappears again, evidently because he's actually a soldier on leave and he has to go back to his regiment. But a few weeks later, months later, he comes back, explaining that he's been to Mexico to teach the light infantry exercise to the Mexicans, which the fairies taught him. And as far as we know, the trail goes cold eventually. Simon Young has done his best researching this. But as far as we know, the elderly couple had their remaining years gladdened and enlightened by this kind of talented Mr. Ripley of Fairyland, who lived with them until they died. He actually managed to leave the army. He tried to buy his way out. They wouldn't let him. They tried to court-martial him and then decided he was insane, so they let him out of the army anyway. So he was free to live with his adoptive parents. And I suppose here, as with the other case of the Sounds of Infinity, I would ask you passionately, would you want to tell them the truth? Okay, now, up close, still closer. One of the things I didn't expect I'd have to worry about when I started researching this book was whether or not fairies were real, okay? Now, this is the point at which credulity stretches to sort of breaking point and goes twang, crack, even more than with poltergeists. But I would recommend, if you want an interesting read, get hold of the fairy census. There is a total fairy census worldwide, compiled by Simon Young. It is online. It's extraordinary reading. But I'll just give you a few examples from a book which also Young edited called Seeing Fairies. First off, we're in, would you guess it, Ireland, and we're about 6 miles from Rathkeil. People all over Limerick are coming to see the leprechauns. The leprechauns are about 2 feet in height and had hard, hairy faces with no ears. They run extremely fast. Men and boys chase them at a pace, and they leap over ditches like greyhounds. I'm often reminded with this of the lovely scenes in E.T., the climax, when you've got these wonderful children on their bikes in the old days with BMXs and no helmets, hurtling after E.T. and simply want to sort of touch him by the hand, and the whole American military complex is coming down on this like a hammer to do other things. Well, there's not so much romance as you might think. I like to think of the child who held the fairy's hand as a kind of E.T. boy, because he did apparently hold the leprechaun's hand. But at the same time, there was a rather more mercenary motivation, which was if you could catch a leprechaun and keep him in a box for a year and a day, you could get him to reveal to you where his treasure was. So, when was this? 1938, autumn. It got into the Times, and shortly after it had been in the Times, a resident of County Monaghan, who was an Irish nationalist, an old Etonian and a graduate of Cambridge, Sir John Randolph Leslie, wrote to the paper to assert that evidence for the existence of fairies was, quote, good enough for courts of law. Good enough for courts of law. It's not the only time we will hear this. Okay, back over into Wales, undated 20th century account. A retired character is fly fishing for trout on a summer morning where a river flows beneath some Welsh moorland. And he's got a trout, he's hooked a big trout, and he's playing it clear of the weeds. He suddenly hears this voice gabbling at him. It's in English, it's a Welsh accent, it's high-pitched, and this character behind him is gabbling, I like trouts, Tommy, I like trouts, catch him, Tommy, I like trouts, catch him. And the poor guy's furious because he likes fishing on his own, and he's trying to concentrate on the fish. Anyway, he sees this chap, elderly, about this high, wearing green trousers pulled high up his waist, and he's got short grizzled beard, grey hair, no hat, all very precise description, and he's waving his arms, and so this chap replies, okay, I haven't caught him yet, let me catch him. Turns around, and the gabbling stops to his relief. He catches the trout, pulls it out. He turns back again to see this chap, and the guy has disappeared. And I'll quote you here. I looked up and my visitor had evaporated. This really did give me a shock, and my heart missed a beat. He had disappeared completely in open ground, as he could not have regained the stile at the end of the road bridge, some 150 yards away, and uphill in the few seconds during which I had looked away. I made inquiries in the village, but nobody knew or had seen anyone in any way like the visitor I had described. Italics, how did he know my name? It was his real name, and if you've detected a certain no-nonsense military precision in that account, you're quite on the ball. It was a Commander T.A. Powell, who doesn't sound, as he says, like the kind of man to see visions. Here's another vision. We're going to duck indoors to give ourselves a breather from all this terror, and we're inside now in Gillingham in Kent, time of the Boer War, 1900, 1901. This is being recalled much later by the Observer. Every night he was put to bed, kissed goodnight by his mother, and every night column after column of tiny soldiers, about 9 inches high, always, let me get this right, because he's very precise about the always from right to left. They processed from right to left, red coats, playing wonderful martial music, like no music he's ever heard anywhere else. And it goes on for several minutes, this march past, every single night, for months this happens. He says, I never tried to touch the soldiers, but they were completely real. I actually did see them, and I should be prepared to state this on oath, if necessary, in any court of law. Okay, who was this character? Victor Purcell, who was, at the time of speaking, a history lecturer at Cambridge. So what have we got? We've got Thomas Wood, Oxbridge history, music don. We've got Victor Purcell, Cambridge history lecturer. And we've got Randolph Leslie, who was an old Etonian and an Oxbridge graduate. Well, I don't know about you, but if I really want to be sure of believing something, I always ask an old Etonian who's been to Oxford. I mean, totally. Well, this sounds a bit irreverent here, actually. I'm shocked at this heresy. What are we going to do if we can no longer believe old Etonians who've been to Oxford or Cambridge? What is the world coming to? Well, the only option, I think, is to talk to a dog. Here we are in 1961. A man is walking his dog in daylight, near St Asaph in Denbighshire. He taps his muddy walking stick a few times on a metal road sign, and suddenly a little man, 3 feet tall, appeared beside it, almost as if the tapping had summoned him. The figure had a very malevolent air, a very ugly brown face, and was dressed all in green. The dog also felt ill at ease, for he growled and raised his hackles. The little man suddenly disappeared after only a short while. So, as you might know, if you're dealing with ghosts and poltergeists, it's rather useful to take, despite all the sort of high-tech jiggery-pokery people invoke, it's a good idea to take one of two things, a dog or a child, because they're very good at detecting ghosts and poltergeists. And this is where we get to the strangest stuff. So those of you who've put your hands up, thanks, you'll know a bit about this. Just a quick sketch of poltergeist problems if you don't know much about it. It tends to involve a boy or a girl about 8 to 15 years old. The problems seem to centre on them. They're suffering some kind of personal trauma, and the problems follow them. So what you've got, the quick way to remember this, it's not a haunted house, it's a haunted person. And just to give you a very quick sketch of a very peculiar poltergeist ghost journey I've been on for 6 years, since they ambushed me studying the vampires. I read about this because of the poltergeist turning up there. I went out to the British Museum. I met an old friend. What are you doing? What are you doing? Oh, what are you doing? I'm studying. Have you ever heard of poltergeists? She goes white, goes silent for a minute, says, can we go somewhere private? Tells me about a poltergeist that's been dogging her family for 18 months and has followed them from one house to another when they move. A few weeks later, I went to an old friend, told him the same thing. I've known him for 12 years, and he told me about his poltergeist for the first time. What happens? It can be very mild, it can be very light, it can be very benign. They simply move things around. I was in a pub a few days ago, which is haunted, and the poltergeist just moves plates onto the floor. Doesn't break them, just moves them down. They can actually do small amounts of housework. So controlled movement is quite common with poltergeists. And in vampire country where you've got poltergeists, the vampire poltergeist that was benign would mend your shoes or chop your wood if it wasn't throwing stones at you, banging on your roof, throwing things around the kitchen, pulling sheets off people, pulling them out of bed. That's the less benign stuff that they do. So, fairy poltergeists were reported in Staffordshire, in Norfolk, in Cornwall, in Anglesey. On Tyree in the 19th century, one house was haunted so badly by fairies that the tenants simply abandoned it. Unfortunately, he took a stone from the original house to build the new one, and the problem started again. Reed, the agent, who was the kid, came with him probably, and the problems carried on. Ireland, however, was the place where fairy problems with poltergeists were the most territorial. And the point here was, as you might know, you had 3 areas of danger, and they were fairy paths, fairy trees, and fairy forts. Tree tended to be a thorn, and it was sacred. So, in County Antrim, one man, when he was drunk, cut down a fairy tree. The next day was found in bed, alive, but with his head turned around back to front. Now, a fairy tree and a fairy fort, as a man-made Iron Age fort perhaps, looked unusual, fairies lived inside it, were easy things because you knew where they were, you knew what to do about them. And sure enough, in 1911 and 1912, in Westmeath, the Count Sir Gilleran was trying to dispose of cheap housing for labourers, and found that he could not get rid of cottages near fairy forts. He finally gave up in 1912 and said, what the heck, I'll take it myself. So all across Ireland, you had pretty much no legal building regulation. The way to build a cabin was to hire a fiddler, get all your friends, build the cabin, dance to the fiddle, build the cabin, dance to the fiddle until you were finished. But you had fairy building regulations. So a character called Paddy Bain, let's give a couple more examples now, built a new house and took his young wife into it in the early 20th century. And on one corner abutting the road, he got hammering noises. And I have heard of these very directly from various people. It sounds like the whole house is going to fall down. So he consulted the local wise woman, what's going on? Local wise woman, oh Christ, you've built a house across the corner of a fairy path. The problem with fairy paths, you didn't know where they were till you asked the wise woman. So he simply sliced a corner off the house to free up the fairy path. You can see, apparently, Paul Devereux can tell you about this, houses with corners sliced off all across Ireland. So, yeah, the most serious kind of end of this was a chap sometime before 1915 in Queen's County, spent £500, a lot of money at the time, on a new house. He moved into it. There was a small amount of movement and so forth. Then it turned into banging, hammering, things thrown around. He was beaten to a pulp almost. It's unusual with poltergeist, but this was very, very violent. When he'd recovered, he tried to move back. He gave up. And come 1915, it was still empty. So just one last example indoors and back in England. I don't know if anyone knows of a place called Denton Hall near Newcastle, but Denton Hall is genuinely haunted. If you ring up the custodians, they'll tell you about it. There's lots of reports from the 19th century of a woman in a silk dress, blocking doorways, talking to people, terrifying the wits out of guests so that they came down at breakfast, demanded to be taken straight away and wouldn't say a word about what had happened. But if you cut to a happier time around the turn of the 19th, 20th century, a couple of old ladies lived there very happily with a fairy that they described as silky, silk dress, silky, and this character was a kind of friendly brownie that laid fires for them, swept the grates, and left little bunches of flowers around. Catherine Briggs, the fairy pioneer, actually heard of this through a friend who knew them. So there you've got your friendly fairy poltergeist doing chores, it's happy with you, it agrees with you. A family moves in later during World War II, and the son, now he's probably 12, 13, right age, finds that his room is beset with poltergeist hammerings so bad and so violent that the family simply moves out. It simply can't stay there. So a nice kind of litmus test. You've got one being, and it acts up with one set of tenants, not with another. What do we learn from this? Well, curious thing is that I found that although a surprising number of people have experienced poltergeists, do take them seriously, and sometimes I'll meet someone for half an hour on a train and they'll tell me a story, we do seem to have created a new taboo. If you suffer a poltergeist, you can get a lot of aggravation online, locally, etc. But actually, these irrational people, these superstitious people, knew what to do. They had a community, they didn't get any abuse, and the point about poltergeists is if you calm down, the problem is much more likely to stop. So you find out what the problem is, you slice the corner off your house, everybody calms down. Because you've calmed down, it stops, job done, it's solved. So, yeah, in this irrational world, people had a solution which was much more rational than just saying, it's not happening, you are mad, you are stupid. If you acknowledge that it's happening, you can do something about it. So, what have we learned here? Well, ghosts and poltergeists, I've found, to my surprise, and it still makes my head hurt, are not just a fairy tale. And maybe fairy tales aren't fairy tales either entirely. If anyone wants to sue me for frightening them and giving them nightmares tonight, I can comfort you by reminding you that in my experience, especially at the moment, the living seem to be much more terrifying than the dead. So let's hope we can all do something about that in 3 weeks and clean the world up. Thank you very much.